Welcome to the Midnight Library, a place where the night feels calm, the world slows down, and stories become a gentle pathway to rest. Find a quiet spot, settle in, and let your body sink into stillness. Breathe deeply in and out, leaving the day behind. This is your time to rest, your time to dream, your time to drift. And now, let us begin tonight's story.
The wind carried the faint scent of rain that evening, brushing softly along Mapplewood Lane as though it, too, had grown tired from the long summer day. The sky glowed with the last traces of pink and gold, and somewhere down the road, a window light flickered to life, a single square of warmth against the growing dusk. It was the sort of neighborhood where time seemed to forget its duties, where seasons changed slowly, and where the nights arrived not as intruders, but as gentle guests. At the very end of the lane stood a little white house with green shutters and ivy curling up its sides. It had once been brighter, perhaps, but now it carried the faded charm of things that have lived well. The porch creaked when you stepped on it, the screen door sang its old squeaky tune, and the air around it always smelled faintly of cedar and paper. Inside that house, on a small writing desk near the window, lay a neat stack of envelopes tied with a thin, fraying ribbon. Their edges had yellowed with age, and each one was sealed with care, marked in graceful handwriting, the kind that people used when they still believed letters could reach the heart more surely than words ever spoken aloud. The house belonged to Eleanor Finch. She was a quiet woman, silver-haired and steady, with the kind of gaze that had learned to look both backward and forward at once. Her days followed a rhythm as simple and sure as the ticking of the old clock in her hallway. Mornings began with tea and the rustle of the newspaper. Afternoons passed in the garden where she still tended the roses her husband had planted years ago. And in the evenings, as twilight crept over the rooftops, she sat at her desk and wrote letters. No one knew to whom she wrote them. The mailman, Mr. Harris, had stopped asking long ago. Sometimes she sent them out, but often she didn't. Sometimes she simply wrote them, folded them with care, sealed them, and added them to the ribboned bundle that lived in the drawer beside her chair. Each letter was addressed the same way, to you, whoever finds your way here. That evening, as the rain began to whisper against the roof, Eleanor lit the small lamp beside her desk and took out a fresh sheet of paper. Her hands were slower these days, but still graceful, each movement deliberate, each stroke of ink filled with quiet purpose. She began to write, her words flowing softly into the hush of the room. "Dear you," she began. "I don't know if you'll ever read this. Perhaps it will stay here, tucked away, waiting for someone who needs it. But tonight, as the rain returns to Mapplewood Lane, I felt that familiar ache to write again. Not because I expect an answer, but because I have learned that sometimes, the act of writing is an answer all on its own." Outside, the rain gathered strength, pattering against the window panes in gentle rhythm. The lamplight shimmered on the glass, and in its reflection, Eleanor's face appeared faint and golden, lined with years but soft with peace. She paused, pen hovering over the paper, listening to the sound of the storm. Somewhere within it, she thought she could hear a voice, a memory she had long since learned not to chase, but never to forget. She smiled faintly and continued. "There are nights when I still imagine the footsteps on the porch, the sound of laughter at the door. I imagine the kettle boiling, and the way your voice would fill the kitchen like a song that had always belonged here. But tonight, it's only me, and the sound of rain. Still, it feels less lonely than you might think. Some silences are companions in disguise." She signed the letter simply, "Yours, always," and left it to dry beside the lamp. Then she leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the window where the world was now blurred and softened by the rain. The roses in the garden trembled, bowing under the gentle weight of the drops. Across the lane, the lights of the old bookstore flickered on, Willow and Sons booksellers, though there hadn't been a Son there for years. The shop belonged to Daniel Hale, a man in his early 40s who had returned to Mapplewood Lane after too long in the city. He had come back for reasons he couldn't quite name, perhaps because the city's noise had become too sharp, or because he had found one too many empty mornings without meaning. The bookstore had been his father's, and though the roof leaked and the shelves creaked, Daniel loved it. Each book, each dust-laden corner felt like a conversation waiting to happen. That evening, as the rain fell harder, Daniel closed the shutters and put a kettle on the stove. He liked nights like these, nights when the world outside seemed far away and small. He was about to settle into his reading chair when he noticed something lying by the door, an envelope, damp around the edges, carried in by the wind. He picked it up carefully, brushing off the raindrops. The paper was old, but the writing clear. To you, whoever finds your way here. Daniel hesitated. It wasn't addressed to him by name, but curiosity has a way of softening hesitation. He turned the envelope over and broke the seal. Inside was a single page, the ink slightly faded but still legible. He began to read. The words were simple, tender, and strangely familiar, like hearing your own thoughts spoken aloud by someone you've never met. They spoke of quiet evenings, of love remembered not in pain but in peace, of the way certain moments stay with us long after the world moves on. By the time he finished reading, the rain outside had slowed, and something in his chest had softened. He looked toward the window, toward the faint outline of the little white house across the lane. The lamp in the window still glowed, steady and warm. He didn't know the woman who lived there, but he suddenly felt as though he did. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope, setting it on the counter beside the till. He would return it in the morning, he decided. For now, it felt enough just to sit in its company. The clock on the wall ticked softly. The storm eased into a drizzle. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt the quiet wasn't empty at all. As the night deepened, both houses, hers and his, glowed faintly against the dark, two beacons of small, steady warmth along the rain-soaked lane. And between them, unseen but alive, something began to stir, the first threads of connection, the gentle echo of words traveling through time and silence, waiting to be heard. Would you like me to continue part 2 right away, where Daniel visits Eleanor the next morning and the story begins to unfold around the letter's mysterious origin and emotional meaning? It will keep the same soft, sleep story rhythm and tone. The rain lasted through the night, falling in long, whispering curtains that softened everything it touched. Mapplewood Lane looked like a dreamscape beneath the lamplight, slick cobblestones, glistening leaves, a faint mist rising where puddles gathered in the hollows of the road. The white house at the end of the lane stood quiet, its windows glowing faintly through the downpour like beacons guiding lost travelers home. Inside, Eleanor slept in her armchair, the letter still drying beside the lamp, her glasses resting on the open book in her lap. The steady rhythm of rain against glass was her lullaby. In her dreams, she walked through a garden that no longer existed. The air was fragrant with lilacs and wet earth, and the sky above shimmered in hues of twilight blue. She could hear footsteps on the gravel path behind her, not hurried, but familiar, comfortable, the way someone walks when they already know they belong. She turned, and there he was, Thomas. The way she remembered him, tall, kind eyes, that same quiet smile. He reached for her hand, and she took it without hesitation. They didn't speak, not with words. But in that dream language that hearts remember long after time forgets, she knew he was saying he was proud of her. That he was still here, just not where she could see. And as the rain began to fall in her dream too, he brushed a droplet from her cheek, or maybe it was a tear, and said, "Keep writing, Ellie. It's how I find my way to you." When she woke, the first gray light of morning had begun to spread across the sky. The rain had quieted to a soft drizzle. Her teacup sat cold beside her, and the letter she'd written the night before was now perfectly dry. She smiled faintly, touching the page as though to thank it for what it had given her. Then, as she reached for the drawer to place it with the others, she paused. Something was missing, one of the letters that had been on the desk. Across the lane, Daniel was already awake. He hadn't slept much, not because he was restless, but because his mind kept returning to the letter. It wasn't only the words that moved him, it was their gentleness, the way they seemed to have been written directly to some quiet part of him he hadn't listened to in years. After years of noise and deadlines and the city's relentless hum, those words felt like a hand resting on his shoulder. He folded the letter once more and slipped it into his coat pocket before heading out. The morning air was cool, heavy with the scent of rain-soaked leaves. A few birds called softly from the trees, as though testing the new day. When he reached the little white house, he hesitated at the gate. The ivy clung thick around the fence posts, and the roses, though a little overgrown, were still blooming stubbornly, bright against the gray light. He knocked gently. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the soft sound of footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, and finally, the door opened a little. Eleanor stood there, her gray hair pinned loosely, her cardigan wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes, pale, steady, curious, met his, and in that small space of silence, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. Or maybe simply the comfort of seeing another soul awake so early. "I think this belongs to you," Daniel said quietly, holding out the envelope. She blinked, surprised, then looked down at it. When she saw the familiar handwriting, her lips curved into a smile, not one of embarrassment, but of quiet understanding. "Ah," she said softly. "So it found you." "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "It must have blown over last night in the wind. I read it before I realized it wasn't addressed to anyone in particular." "That's quite all right," Eleanor said. Her voice was low and warm, like the hum of a cello. "Those letters aren't meant to be kept secret. They're meant to find whoever needs them most. Seems this one found you." Daniel hesitated, unsure how to respond. The simplicity of her words disarmed him. "It did," he admitted finally. "More than I expected." Eleanor's smile deepened. "Then it's done its work." She pushed the door open a little wider. "Would you like some tea?" He followed her inside, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. The house was small but full of warmth, the kind of place where every object seemed to have a story. Framed photographs lined the mantel, a young woman in a white dress standing beside a man in uniform, a garden in full bloom, a dog with soft eyes and a tilted head. On the table lay more envelopes, each carefully stacked, each addressed to you. They sat in the kitchen, where the light came in through a lace curtain, turning the air golden. Eleanor poured tea into two mismatched cups and slid one across to him. Neither spoke for a while. The silence wasn't awkward, it was companionable, a soft, living thing between them. After a while, Daniel said, "You've written a lot of these?" "Dozens," she said, looking toward the window. "Maybe more." I started after my husband passed. There were so many things I still wanted to tell him, and writing them down helped me keep breathing. After a while, I realized they weren't only for him. They were for anyone who needed to feel less alone. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. That's beautiful, he said. It's ordinary, Eleanor replied with a small smile. And that's what makes it beautiful. He looked at the letters again, each one tied with ribbon. Do you mind if I ask, have any others ever been found? A few, she said. Sometimes I leave them in the bookstore across the lane. Your father used to let me tuck them between the pages of old books. He said they were like bookmarks for the soul. Daniel's eyes softened. You knew my father? Oh, yes, she said, her smile tinged with nostalgia. A kind man. Always had ink on his fingers. He used to stop by every Friday with a fresh loaf of bread from the bakery. We'd sit here and talk about books and time and all the little things that make life quietly wonderful. Daniel smiled faintly, his gaze drifting toward the rain-streaked window. That sounds like him. They spoke for a long while, about the town, about books, about the small rituals that make up a life. When he finally stood to leave, the rain had stopped, and sunlight filtered through the thinning clouds. Eleanor handed him one of the letters, freshly written. For when the quiet feels too heavy, she said. He nodded, unable to find the right words. Then he tucked the envelope into his pocket and walked back down the lane, the world around him brighter than before. That night, after closing the shop, he sat by the window and opened the letter. Inside were just a few lines. Sometimes the universe sends us echoes before it sends us answers. Listen to the small sounds, footsteps, rain, the turning of pages. That's where the heart hides its truth. He folded the letter slowly, his eyes wet in the soft lamplight. Then he looked out across the lane. Eleanor's lamp still burned, steady and gold. He raised his cup in a silent toast, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something like home. Would you like me to continue, where Daniel begins finding more of Eleanor's letters hidden around town, each revealing pieces of a love story that changes both of their lives? It will stay gentle, warm, and poetic, perfect for your deep sleep narration style. The next morning dawned with a pale golden light that poured softly across Mapplewood Lane. The rain had washed the world clean, and everything shimmered faintly, the rooftops, the cobblestones, the trees heavy with droplets that sparkled like tiny glass beads. Daniel opened the door of the old bookstore, letting in the scent of wet earth and paper. The bell above the door chimed gently, and the familiar hush of the shop welcomed him. He moved through the aisles, fingers grazing the spines of books he had known since childhood. The air still carried traces of his father, the faint musk of old wood, ink, and dust, the smell that lived between words and memory. It felt like he was walking through a letter himself, one written by time and left here for him to find. As he reached the back shelf near the poetry section, he noticed something new, or perhaps something he had overlooked. A small envelope, neatly tucked between two volumes of Frost and Dickinson. His heart gave a small, unexpected flutter. He reached for it, the paper cool against his fingertips. The front bore the same simple words, "To you." He smiled softly to himself, unfolded it, and began to read. If you find this, you are standing in a place full of ghosts, not the kind that frighten, but the kind that whisper. Every story ever read, every hand that turned a page, every sigh of recognition that escaped a reader's lips still lives here. Listen closely. The shelves remember you. Daniel exhaled slowly, letting the words sink into him like a slow tide. He folded the letter back into its envelope and tucked it into his coat. When he looked out the window toward Eleanor's house, her curtains were drawn, her lamp already lit. He wondered how many letters she had scattered through the town, how many hearts she had quietly touched. Days passed, and Daniel began to notice the quiet ways the lane seemed alive again. Children splashed in puddles where the rain had left its footprints, and the scent of bread drifted from the bakery just as it used to. The postman lingered a little longer by the gardens, and the cats that roamed the streets slept curled beneath the ivy instead of wandering far. One afternoon, he found another letter. It had been slipped under the bookstore door, the edges slightly damp from the morning dew. Sometimes we are meant to cross paths not by accident, but by the gentle pull of something larger than chance. When hearts carry similar silences, they recognize each other. They listen. That is how stories begin, quietly, between two souls who didn't expect to meet. Daniel sat down behind the counter, the letter trembling faintly in his hands. He read it again and again, until the ink seemed to blur into meaning rather than words. Then, slowly, he began to write a reply. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the stillness of the shop, or the faint hum of memory that lingered in Eleanor's letters. Maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. He found a small sheet of paper and wrote, "I used to think loneliness was silence. But now I think it's just a story waiting for an answer. Thank you for writing first." He didn't sign it. He didn't know what to call himself in this story yet. But the next morning, he slipped it under Eleanor's door before sunrise and walked away before she could see him. That evening, when he returned home, there was a small envelope waiting on his doorstep. Sometimes the right words don't come from trying to speak. They come from being still long enough to listen. Thank you for listening. It went on like that for weeks. Letters passed quietly across Mapplewood Lane, under doors, between pages, beneath teacups left on garden tables. No names, no demands, just words carried by trust and curiosity. Their exchange became the heartbeat of their days. In time, Daniel began to learn more about her without ever asking. Through her words, he could feel the rhythm of her mornings, the sound of the kettle, the creak of the window as she opened it to let in the smell of rain, the way she spoke to the stray cat that visited her porch. Her world was small, but full, stitched together by kindness and memory. And Eleanor, in turn, began to learn the shape of Daniel's silence. His letters carried the faint ache of someone rebuilding, the quiet of a man who'd lost too much but was slowly learning to love the ordinary again. He wrote about the way the shop breathed when it was empty, how he sometimes left the lamp burning at night so it wouldn't feel so alone. As autumn came, the trees along Mapplewood Lane began to turn. The air grew cooler, the nights longer. The rain returned, softer now, like a familiar song. And still, the letters came. One evening, Eleanor wrote, "Do you ever wonder if the rain remembers us? It falls on everything, old roofs, new gardens, forgotten roads, and yet it never seems to mind where it lands. Maybe that's what love is. Not belonging to one place, but finding beauty wherever it falls." When Daniel read it, something in him stirred. He had spent so many years moving from place to place, chasing something unnamed, hoping that maybe one day he'd feel at home again. But here, on this quiet lane, reading her words by the light of a small lamp, he realized he already did. One morning, as the first frost painted the windows, Daniel crossed the lane again. He carried 2 cups of coffee and a small box of pastries from the bakery. Eleanor opened the door before he even knocked, as though she'd been waiting. "I thought maybe we could share breakfast," he said softly. Eleanor smiled, stepping aside. "I was hoping you'd say that." They sat together in her kitchen, steam rising gently from their cups. The conversation came slowly, comfortably, like two rivers meeting after a long journey. They talked of little things, the weather, the books they loved, the sound of rain on different kinds of roofs. And when silence fell, it wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. After breakfast, Daniel noticed something new. On the wall near the window hung a framed letter, yellowed and worn, but preserved carefully. He leaned closer to read it. "My dearest Eleanor, if ever the rain begins to sound like music, know that it's me, listening with you. Thomas." Daniel turned to her, his heart catching in his chest. "You've kept all of them?" "Every one," she said softly. "Not because I couldn't let go, but because I never wanted to forget how it felt to be loved with such gentleness." He nodded, the moment wrapping around them like a blanket. Outside, the wind stirred the last leaves from the trees. From then on, Daniel and Eleanor met often. Sometimes to talk, sometimes to share tea, sometimes just to sit quietly while the rain came and went. The letters slowed, not because they stopped needing words, but because they had begun to speak in silences, in gestures, glances, and shared mornings. As winter deepened, the world outside turned still. The snow came softly, layering the rooftops and the lane in white. Inside, the two of them continued their quiet ritual, two souls tethered by words, finding warmth in the cold. Years later, when the bookstore changed hands and Eleanor's house stood empty, the new owner found a stack of letters in a drawer, bound neatly with ribbon. On the top one was written, "If you are reading this, you have found Mapplewood Lane. This is not just a street. It's a place where hearts find their echoes. If you ever feel alone, write. Someone is always listening." And beneath it, a second envelope, sealed in fresh ink. It read simply, "For Daniel, who reminded me that stories never end, they just change the hands that write them. Would you like me to expand the story further, showing the later years, where Daniel continues the tradition of leaving letters around the lane, keeping Eleanor's kindness alive through generations?" It would make a beautifully calm, heartfelt ending for a deep sleep story. In the years that followed, Mapplewood Lane seemed to exist in its own kind of time, untouched, unhurried, quietly breathing in rhythm with the seasons. The bookstore remained the heart of it all, glowing each evening with a soft amber light that spilled onto the street. Daniel had turned one of the back rooms into a small reading nook with a single armchair, a lamp, and a window that framed the maple tree outside. People from the town often wandered in just to sit for a while. They'd pick a book, sometimes not even open it, and simply rest in the hush that filled the air. On the counter, beside the cash register, was a small wooden box labeled "Letters for Whoever Needs One." Inside, folded neatly, were slips of paper filled with quiet words, some by Daniel, some copied from old letters he'd found, and a few even in Eleanor's handwriting. People would take one when they came in. Some would smile and tuck it in their pocket. Others would return a week later, bringing one of their own to leave behind. Over time, the box became heavier, fuller, as if the town itself had learned to write back. Sometimes, on evenings when the wind brushed softly against the windows, Daniel would light a candle near the old shelf where he'd found Eleanor's first letter. He'd pour himself a cup of tea, open the window a crack, and listen. The rain still came often to Mapplewood Lane, and in its rhythm he could almost hear her voice, low, patient, kind. The years had changed many things, but not the sound of rain, and not the way it seemed to listen before it fell. One afternoon, a young woman wandered into the shop. She looked around with the curious eyes of someone who hadn't been there before but somehow felt she already knew it. Her coat was damp, her cheeks pink from the chill. "Are you the one who writes the letters?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Sometimes," he said. "But not all of them." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found this under the old bridge," she said. It said, "When the world feels too heavy, remember that even the rain doesn't fall forever." I thought maybe it came from here. He took the note gently, reading the words. He recognized his handwriting, something he'd written years ago on a quiet morning when he didn't think anyone would ever see it. "Yes," he said softly. "It came from here." The girl smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "It helped," she said simply, and left the store without another word. Daniel watched her go, the bell chiming faintly in her wake. For a long time, he stood there in the hush that followed, feeling something vast and wordless move through him, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that kindness, once set free, never really stops traveling. That night, he sat by the fire with a notebook and began to write again. He wrote not to anyone in particular, but to the lane itself, to the rain, to the memory of voices that had once filled his days. "Mapplewood Lane is more than a place," he wrote. "It's a conversation. Between what has been lost and what still listens. Between silence and the sound of falling rain." He placed the page in the wooden box and blew out the candle. The flame flickered for a moment, then vanished, leaving behind a faint thread of smoke curling upward like a whispered goodbye. The snow came early that winter. The world softened under its weight, every sound muffled, every shadow blurred. Daniel took long walks through the white streets, his boots crunching against the frost. Sometimes he'd stop near Eleanor's old house, now occupied by a young family. He never spoke to them, but he often saw the little girl who lived there sitting by the window with a book open in her lap, her lips moving as she read aloud to the air. It made him smile. On Christmas Eve, the town gathered for the small festival it held each year. Lanterns lined the street, glowing like captured stars. The bakery smelled of cinnamon, the post office was strung with garlands, and the bookstore doors stayed open late, welcoming anyone who needed warmth. Daniel stood by the window, a cup of cider in his hands, watching the snow fall. For a moment, he thought he saw her, Eleanor, standing by the lamppost across the lane, her coat buttoned, her scarf trailing in the wind. She smiled, or maybe it was just the way the light bent through the snow. And then she was gone. He didn't feel sadness. Just a quiet peace, the kind that fills the heart when it realizes that nothing truly good ever disappears. Years passed, and when Daniel grew older, his hair turning white like the snow that had once blanketed his childhood winters, he wrote one final letter. He placed it in the wooden box, tucked beneath all the others, and sealed it with wax. To whoever finds this, it read, "There is a lane in a small town where the rain writes stories and the letters never stop arriving. If you ever feel alone, go there. Stand beneath the old maple tree and listen. The world will speak to you in ways you forgot it could. And when you return home, write a letter of your own. Leave it somewhere for a stranger to find." That is how the story continues. When Daniel passed, the town mourned him quietly. The bookstore remained closed for a week, its window filled with candles and flowers. And then one day, the door opened again. A young man from out of town, one of Daniel's distant relatives, had come to take over. He found the shop just as it had always been, the air still holding that faint, papery calm. On his first night there, he sat at the counter, reading through the letters in the box. By the time he reached the bottom, tears glistened in his eyes. He read Daniel's final note again, then reached for a clean sheet of paper and began to write, "Dear Mapplewood Lane, thank you for waiting." Outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, and kind. It tapped gently against the window, as if applauding. Somewhere, in the distance, the sound of laughter drifted down the street. And above it all, the steady rhythm of the rain carried on, telling the same story it always had, about love, about listening, about the quiet courage it takes to keep writing even when the world forgets how. In the years that followed, the lane never grew silent. The letters kept appearing, tucked between books, slipped into mailboxes, left beneath park benches. No one knew who wrote them anymore, but everyone agreed on one thing: they always arrived when you needed them most. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the rain swept through the town and the lights dimmed low, those who walked Mapplewood Lane swore they could hear the soft rustle of paper in the wind, as if someone, somewhere, was still writing. In the decades that followed, Mapplewood Lane became something almost mythic, a place that existed on maps, yes, but also in memory, in stories told quietly between friends, in the pauses between raindrops. Visitors came and went, drawn not by signs or advertisements, but by a whisper passed along through time. If you ever find yourself in need of peace, go to the lane where the letters wait. The little bookstore still stood at the corner, its brick facade softened by ivy and its windows glowing every evening with that same gentle amber light. Children who had once listened to stories there grew up and brought their own children back, tracing their fingers along the shelves where their parents had once found comfort. And always, always, the box of letters remained. It had changed a little over the years, repaired once when the hinges rusted, polished when the surface dulled, but its spirit had not. By then, it was Clara who ran the bookstore. She had come from another town entirely, drawn to Mapplewood by a story her grandmother used to tell her before bed. The story of a lane that listened, of rain that remembered, of letters that waited for you when you thought no one ever would. As a child, Clara had thought it was only a fairy tale. But when her life became crowded with noise and she found herself longing for quiet, she decided to see if it was real. It was late spring when she arrived. The air smelled of lilacs and old paper, and the bookstore looked just as her grandmother had described, small, welcoming, and lit by the soft hum of warmth that lived in places filled with kindness. When she stepped inside, the bell above the door sang the same familiar note that had once greeted Daniel, and the sound seemed to echo faintly, like an old friend recognizing her. Behind the counter, an elderly man smiled at her, the last apprentice Daniel had ever trained. "You must be Clara," he said, his voice soft as the turning of a page. "He told me someone would come." She blinked in surprise. "Daniel?" He nodded. "He said the lane always calls the right people at the right time." He placed the small wooden box in front of her. "I've been keeping this safe. But it's yours now, if you'll listen to it." Clara rested her hands on the box. The wood was warm beneath her fingers, as if it held a heartbeat. She lifted the lid and saw the stack of letters, some yellowed, others fresh, tied with ribbons, pressed with wax, folded in secret ways. The air above them smelled faintly of rain and ink. That night, Clara stayed in the bookstore long after the town had gone to sleep. She read each letter slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, as though afraid to disturb the stillness. There were hundreds, from Eleanor to Daniel, from townsfolk to strangers, from generations that had come and gone. They spoke of sorrow, of hope, of quiet mornings and second chances. But more than anything, they spoke of love, the kind that doesn't ask to be seen, only to be felt. As she read, the rain began to fall. It came softly at first, then steadier, a patient rhythm against the glass. And for a moment, she thought she heard faint laughter in the sound of it, not loud, but real, like someone smiling from far away. From that night onward, Clara became the keeper of the lane. She didn't try to change it or modernize it. She simply tended it, dusted the shelves, lit the lamps, repaired the creaks in the floorboards, and kept the box of letters open for anyone who needed them. She learned the faces of those who came by often, the teacher who stopped in after school to leave notes of encouragement for her students, the widower who slipped in on rainy days to read old poetry aloud to the silence, the young boy who left drawings folded into paper boats. Sometimes, when the nights grew long and the snow pressed against the windows, Clara would find herself talking to the air, as though the old souls who had once walked the lane still lingered. She'd tell them about the people who came, the kindness that bloomed quietly in the smallest corners of the world, the way the rain still whispered their names. Years later, after Clara had grown older herself, she wrote her own letter, not to anyone specific, but to the lane, to the rain, to all who had ever found peace within its quiet heart. Dear Mapplewood Lane, she wrote, thank you for teaching me that we do not need to be loud to be heard, nor seen to be remembered. Every kindness, no matter how small, becomes a story. Every silence, when filled with care, becomes a song. I will be listening for you, always, in the sound of the rain. When Clara passed, the townspeople found her final letter resting atop the wooden box, sealed with a wax stamp in the shape of a leaf. Beneath it, they found another letter in unfamiliar handwriting, for whoever tends the bookstore next, the lane is alive because you listen. Keep listening. The world forgets how to be gentle sometimes. This place reminds it. No one knew who wrote it. Some said it was the man who once apprenticed with Daniel. Others whispered that maybe, just maybe, the rain itself had learned to write. And so it continued. The box never stayed empty. Travelers still came, wanderers, dreamers, people searching for something they couldn't quite name. Each of them left a part of themselves behind, a word, a thought, a letter. Each of them carried something away too, peace, perhaps, or the strange comfort of knowing they weren't alone. The legend of Mapplewood Lane spread quietly across towns and states. Some called it a myth. Others said it was simply a place that taught people to slow down and feel again. But those who had been there knew better. They knew that the lane was real, and that the rain truly listened. On nights when the moon was full and the wind drifted softly through the trees, it was said that you could still see a faint light in the bookstore window. And if you listened closely, if you stood perfectly still and let the sound of the rain sink into you, you could hear the faint rustle of paper, the turning of a page, and the whisper of two voices long past saying quietly, "Are you listening?" Always. And somewhere beyond the edges of time, Mapplewood Lane continued to breathe, not in the way streets do, but in the way stories do, endlessly, patiently, beautifully. The seasons drifted endlessly over Mapplewood Lane, wrapping the little town in a rhythm that felt timeless. Each year the trees blossomed with pale petals that floated like whispers through the air, and in autumn they turned to amber flames that lined the cobbled streets with soft crunches underfoot. The years passed, but the soul of the lane never aged, it only deepened, like music echoing down a long, sunlit corridor. The bookstore had changed caretakers many times since Clara's passing, each one drawn not by ambition but by something gentler, a quiet tug in the heart that led them down the rain-slicked path one evening, to the door with the brass bell and the scent of paper and time. No one ever applied for the position. The lane simply chose. It had a way of finding those who needed to belong somewhere, those who had a story yet unwritten. Sometimes, on late nights, when fog blanketed the streets and the lamplight shimmered through it like candle smoke, the new keeper would find letters already placed in the box before dawn. They were never left by anyone seen. The postmark was always absent. The handwriting, varied but always familiar, seemed to come from the air itself. Letters from those who had once walked the lane. From Eleanor. From Daniel. From Clara. The past didn't haunt the bookstore, it sang to it, softly, like an old lullaby that only those who truly listened could hear. One letter, written in fading blue ink, was found folded beneath the wooden box itself. It read, "If ever the world grows too heavy, sit by the window when the rain begins. Do not rush to fix or to move. Just listen. The rain will tell you what you've forgotten, that kindness does not vanish, that love does not die, and that all stories find their way home." The new keeper, a quiet man named Thomas, used to read that letter aloud on stormy nights. He had come to the town after losing everything, his work, his home, his sense of purpose. He didn't know why he had turned off the highway that day or why the road had led him here, but when he saw the bookstore's flickering sign, Mapplewood Books and Letters, something in him eased, like a muscle unclenching after years of strain. He didn't speak much, but he tended to the place with deep reverence. He repaired the wooden beams, polished the brass bell, and kept fresh candles by the window. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, people began to return. A young mother who'd just lost her husband came one evening, holding her child's hand. She sat by the window, crying silently as the rain began to fall. When she looked down, there was a letter already waiting beside her, addressed simply, "For the one who carries both love and loss." She never discovered who wrote it, but the words inside healed something she didn't know could be healed. An old violinist began coming on Saturdays, bringing his instrument. He would play quietly between the shelves, pieces so soft they blended with the sound of turning pages. When he stopped, there was always a single envelope left near his chair. No address, just a note in looping script, for the music that reminds us we're still alive. There was a girl named Evie who worked at the bakery down the street. She started slipping poems into the box every week, written on flour-dusted parchment. She never expected replies, but they came anyway. Gentle, guiding, sometimes teasing, as though written by a friend who knew her dreams before she spoke them. In time, her poems grew more hopeful. One night, when the moon was full and the lane glowed silver with dew, she left a note that said, "I used to believe I was invisible. But now, I feel seen." And below it, when she returned the next morning, someone had written, "You always were. The rain just needed to find your name." The townspeople began to think of the letters not as messages, but as bridges, threads connecting lives that might never have crossed otherwise. The box became a living heart, pulsing quietly between them all, binding the lonely to the kind, the grieving to the gentle, the lost to the listening. Thomas often sat near it after closing hours. Sometimes he'd fall asleep at the desk, a candle flickering low beside him. He'd wake to find letters he didn't remember writing, notes written in his own hand, yet carrying words he never would have thought to say. He began to wonder if the lane wrote through him. If maybe that was the gift, to be the vessel, not the author. One especially cold winter, when snow buried the rooftops and silence filled every crack of the town, Thomas fell ill. For weeks the bookstore remained closed. But the people of Mapplewood began to come anyway, brushing the snow from the steps, lighting candles, leaving food by the door. And every morning, without fail, someone found a new letter waiting inside the box, addressed not to anyone, but signed, "From the Lane." When Thomas recovered and returned, he found the shop glowing brighter than ever. The shelves were stacked with letters written by townspeople, each one beginning with the same words, "Dear Mapplewood Lane." They thanked it for listening, for reminding them to be kind, for teaching them that even small words can carry immense warmth. That rain can cleanse not only streets but hearts. And in the years that followed, the lane only grew richer in stories. It became a pilgrimage of sorts, though never commercial, never loud. Just a place where people came when the noise of the world became too much. Where silence wasn't empty, it was healing. Some said that when you stood there at dusk, you could still hear Daniel's laughter mixing with the rain. That you could see Eleanor's reflection in the window glass, humming as she arranged fresh letters. Others claimed Clara's handwriting still appeared on new notes, perfectly familiar, even though no one had written like that in 50 years. But the truth of Mapplewood Lane was not about ghosts. It was about presence, the kind that doesn't fade when a person is gone. It was about words that outlive hands, kindness that echoes through generations, and the strange miracle of strangers connecting through a box of paper and rain. On the 100th anniversary of the bookstore's founding, the townspeople gathered outside. The night was warm, the sky scattered with stars. They read aloud letters written over a century, words of love, regret, hope, forgiveness. The crowd wept and smiled in the same breath. And as midnight struck, a soft drizzle began to fall. Someone whispered, "The lane remembers." And they all fell silent, letting the sound of rain wash over them like a hymn. That night, Thomas, now an old man himself, sat alone in the quiet bookstore. He wrote one final letter, his hands trembling slightly. "To whoever finds this," it began. "Do not think of this place as magic. It is only a mirror. It reflects what we bring to it, love, sorrow, longing, gentleness. The lane listens because someone once decided to listen first. Be that someone. Wherever you go, carry the spirit of this place. Speak softly. Write honestly. Love endlessly. And when the rain comes, remember that you are not alone." He placed the letter into the box, closed the lid, and blew out the candle. The next morning, the townspeople found the bookstore door unlocked, the box empty, except for one envelope, sealed with the same leaf emblem Clara once used. It read, "Thank you for listening." The store was empty, yet not hollow. It felt full, like a breath held between heartbeats. The window glowed faintly even in daylight, and the bell above the door rang softly though no one touched it. And outside, the rain fell, not heavy, but gentle. The kind that lingers on skin, as if reluctant to let go. The sound of it filled the lane, carrying whispers from every era, every soul that had ever passed through. If you were to walk there today, down that quiet, tree-lined road, past the bakery and the stone fountain, toward the little brick building with ivy crawling up its walls, you would still hear it. The hum of stories, the pulse of memory, the delicate chorus of countless hearts speaking across time. And if you stood very still, with the rain in your hair and the scent of old paper in the air, you might just hear a voice, soft and familiar, asking the same question it always has. Are you listening? And somewhere, beyond all sound and silence, another voice would answer, always. The night deepened around Mapplewood Lane as though the stars themselves leaned closer, listening. The bookstore windows glowed like the softest embers in a world that had long forgotten the value of quiet. Inside, the air was filled with the familiar scent of rain-soaked paper, beeswax polish, and the faint trace of lavender from a sachet that had been tucked behind the counter decades ago. The hum of the world outside seemed to stop at the threshold. It was a silence that wasn't empty but alive, full of unseen conversations, of memories breathing just beneath the floorboards. On that final night, the lane felt older than time itself. The cobblestones glistened with reflected moonlight, and a light mist drifted above them, curling like pale smoke. The great oak tree by the fountain creaked softly in the wind, its branches tracing invisible constellations above the rooftops. If you stood beneath it, you could almost believe that the rain wasn't falling on the lane, but from it, like the sky had been drawn down to earth for just a moment. Inside the bookstore, the lamp on the counter burned low, casting an amber glow across the scattered letters and open journals. Thomas sat in his chair, the same one that had belonged to Clara all those years ago. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness but from something sacred, the weight of words, the quiet ache of endings. Around him, every shelf whispered with memory. Each spine, each folded page seemed to hum faintly, as if remembering the hands that once turned them, the eyes that once read them aloud to the night. The clock above the fireplace ticked with soft precision. Somewhere in the rafters, a pair of doves rustled their feathers, settling into sleep. The sound of the rain against the glass became a rhythm, slow, soothing, timeless. It was as if the entire world had slipped into the same gentle heartbeat, syncing with the lane itself. Thomas reached for the final stack of letters that had gathered in the box that day. He opened one at random and smiled faintly. It was written in a child's careful handwriting, "Dear Mapplewood Lane, my grandpa says you listen better than anyone. I think that's true because when I came to your bookstore, I didn't feel invisible anymore. Thank you for letting me draw in the window fog and not getting mad. I'll come back when I'm bigger. Love, Annie." He chuckled softly, brushing a tear from his cheek. He could almost hear her little laugh echoing in the aisles, the sound of small feet running across the worn floorboards. He placed the letter gently atop the others, then leaned back, listening again to the rain. The more he listened, the more he began to hear things beneath the rain's surface. A melody, soft, old, familiar. He couldn't place where he'd heard it before, but it wrapped around him like a lullaby. And then, faintly, came another sound, pages turning, though no one was there. A whisper that wasn't quite a voice, yet it spoke all the same. It's time. He didn't startle. He didn't fear. He only nodded. For he understood now that the lane was never a place, it was a keeper of echoes, of kindness, of every small act that ever softened a heart. He closed his eyes. The world faded into sound and scent and warmth, the rain against the roof, the candle's sigh, the whisper of paper against wood. When the clock struck midnight, the flame flickered once, then went out. But the light didn't vanish. It moved, beyond the candle, beyond the walls, into the mist that hung over the lane. The air shimmered faintly, and for a breathless moment, all the letters in the box lifted, rustling like wings. They danced in the air, swirling in a spiral of words and memories, and then gently settled again, but not where they began. They found their owners. Every person who had ever written a letter to the lane awoke that night to find an envelope waiting on their windowsill, glowing softly in the moonlight. Inside each one was a single line, written in a hand they recognized though they could never quite name. The story continues. Keep listening. And so they did. The next morning, the lane looked the same, but everything had shifted imperceptibly. The bakery smelled sweeter. The fountain's water shimmered clearer. The air itself seemed softer, as if wrapped in something unseen yet deeply felt. People walked slower. They smiled more. They began to write again, to one another, to the past, to themselves. The new letters they left in the box were not confessions anymore, but promises. Promises to be kind. To forgive. To remember. And when they read the replies, for the lane always replied, they swore they could feel warmth in the ink, as if each word had been written by a hand made of rain and light. Years passed. The bookstore changed names again, though the heart of it never did. The ivy grew thicker, the bell above the door rusted into a deeper shade of gold. Children grew up and brought their children to listen to the rain against the windows. And every so often, someone would swear that if you stayed until the very last customer left, just as the lamps dimmed and the world outside turned to silver mist, you could still hear Clara's voice. She would be humming an old tune, one that had no name, yet somehow everyone knew the melody. It would weave through the air like a thread of light, binding the living to the remembered. And if you were quiet enough, if you let your thoughts settle and simply listened, you might feel something brush gently against your heart. A whisper. A wordless comfort. A reminder that even the loneliest souls leave behind echoes that can heal others. Because Mapplewood Lane was never about letters at all. It was about listening, to the world, to one another, to yourself. It was about finding home not in a place, but in a moment of connection that refuses to fade. Somewhere, beyond the hills, the storm rolled away, leaving behind a sky washed clean of sorrow. The first golden light of morning spilled over the rooftops, touching the bookstore's windows. And for a brief, perfect second, the glass reflected not the street, but 100 faces, past and present, smiling as one. And as the first bird began to sing, the lane exhaled softly, the rain's rhythm easing into silence. If you were walking there, right now, you might pass the bookstore and think it ordinary. But if you paused, if you truly paused, you'd feel it. The pulse beneath the cobblestones. The hush of words unsaid. The peace that lives between each drop of rain. And maybe, just maybe, you'd hear it again, faint, patient, eternal. Are you listening? And in your heart, without meaning to, you'd whisper back, always. The morning after the rain felt softer than any morning before. Mapplewood Lane shimmered faintly beneath the light of dawn, as if the mist itself had memory. The air held the scent of soaked leaves, ink, and the sweetness of lilacs carried over from Mrs. Willow's garden at the far end of the street. Every puddle reflected a small piece of the sky, and if you looked long enough, you could almost see movement there, shadows of words, whispers of thoughts that had once been sealed in envelopes and slipped quietly into the box at the bookstore's door. The shop stood as it always had, its sign still swaying gently in the breeze, the letters fading but dignified, Mapplewood Books and Letters. The ivy that had crept along the window panes glistened with dew, curling tenderly over the corners as if to hold the place together. There was a stillness about it, the kind of stillness that only exists in places where love has lingered for too long to ever leave. When Clara's great-niece, Evelyn, arrived that morning, she found the door already unlocked. The key still sat in the lock, warm to the touch, as though someone had just turned it. Inside, The lamps were dark, yet the room was lit all the same. The soft gray light from the window pooled across the counter, touching the old wooden chair, the shelves, and the box of letters left neatly in place. Evelyn had only ever known the lane through stories. As a child, she had sat on her grandmother's lap listening to tales of.
And so, dear dreamer, our story finds its gentle close, but your night continues calm and unbroken. Let your thoughts drift, as lightly as clouds across a moonlit sky. Let your body sink, as deeply as roots into the quiet earth. There is no need to hold on, no need to listen further, only to rest, for the story remains with you, carrying you through the night, until morning's light comes softly to call. Good night, and sweet dreams. From the Midnight Library. Crescent moon sparkles, break time equals 2000/.